I lead a team of project managers that we mainly work on the generation side, but we do dabble in transmission and dam safety as well. I've been with BC Hydro for a little over 18 years, mostly working in a project-related capacity, and for about 15 years, I remained blissfully ignorant of NERC requirements and NERC compliance. Even now, I must say that as a project person, being in a room with this many compliance people is just a little bit terrifying, but I've gotten more used to it, particularly as in early 2021, I was tasked to lead an initiative to integrate more fully our NERC compliance into our project practices. I'll pass it to Sophie.
Hi there. So my name is Sophie Pilkington. I've been working in reliability now for 14 years, and hard to believe this is my first time in person at the WEC Reliability and Security Conference. So I was the Reliability Compliance Manager for a renewable energy company for 12 years. And after those 12 years of working in the IPP world, I took the opportunity to move over to the utility side and to take on a brand new role in BC Hydro, that of Project Compliance Advisor. And I'm very excited to be able to share with you our approach to Project MRS compliance. So why are we here today? Our intent is to leave you with some ideas of how to possibly address similar issues in your organizations. We all have compliance risk, and if us showing you our method of reducing compliance risk through integrating reliability controls into the project lifecycle, sharing our lessons learned and challenges, gives you an idea for something you could try, additional controls you could implement, then we've accomplished what we came here for. And I know we're all about the reliability focus, but a lot of us are also parts of larger compliance teams. And there may also be an opportunity where regulatory applicability, say for environmental or land use, can also be assessed using a similar methodology. Okay, so in our time together, we're going to give you an introduction to BC Hydro. As some of you may not be familiar with us and our structure, we're going to talk about the teams involved in reliability compliance in BC Hydro, the MRS applicability tool, how it came about and the problem we needed to solve. We're going to give you a demonstration of the tool, talk about its implementation and sustainment, and finish with a wrap up and conclude. And of course, we have our contact information included in the presentation. So if you need to reach out to us, but of course, we'll have time for questions at the end.
So just a little bit about BC Hydro. We are a provincial crown corporation, which basically means that we're owned and our single shareholder is the province of BC. On the generation side, we're primarily hydroelectric based, with about 98% of our generation being clean and renewable. And for a little bit of local relevance here, the photo we selected was the Mica Dam and Generating Station. That is at the headworks of the Columbia River, and it was built starting in the early 1960s as part of the Columbia River Treaty. We have average annual generation of around 50,000 gigawatt hours. We've got installed capacity of a little over 12,000 megawatts, and we are a vertically integrated utility. So on the other side of the lines, we serve about 95% of the population of BC. We have about $8 billion in annual revenue and about 7,700 employees. And so when we're talking a little bit about the employees, you may not be able to read all of the business groups here, but I want to leave you with is a sense of the complexity and the many different parts of the organization that play a role in achieving NERC compliance on projects. So the green circles, we're looking at our project teams. We have projects delivered in multiple areas. We have two groups that deliver projects on the power system. We have our properties group and we have our IT projects. IT also plays an important compliance role as well. We also have a dedicated business group for Site C. That's our newest dam and generating station. It's been under construction for 9 years, and we actually achieved first commercial power 2 days ago. So focusing in a little bit on the two power system project groups, our project delivery group works on projects between about $1 million and $1 billion. Inflation's really been making us look hard at that upper range. But so typically we have about 360 active projects in that group. And then our program and contract management team manages some smaller projects, typically up to a few $1 million. And they have more than 500 projects and programs underway at any given time. So on the assurance and compliance side, as a vertically integrated utility and as the system operator for BC, we have many functional registrations, and that can increase the complexity of our compliance processes. We have our reliability standards assurance group who reports through our general counsel and chief compliance officer, and they have a key governance and assurance role across all of their standards. But then responsibility for compliance on specific standards and requirements is distributed across the organization. That's the red circles. And that is with the group that has the relevant subject matter expertise. So that approach ensures that reliability standards are integrated into our business, and compliance responsibility lies with the experts in a given area. But the challenge there is it really creates a lot of complexity, and it creates a many-to-many relationship between our project groups and our compliance groups. And that complexity was becoming a problem. Basically, it was resulting in an increasing number of NERC violations being triggered by projects. So historically, our compliance processes were essentially legacy knowledge. People just knew what to do in their given area. They knew who to provide information to. We had limited process documentation. We had few, if any, controls in our projects group for NERC compliance. And for a long time, this wasn't an issue. What changed? What sort of factors change this? It's probably a variety of things: an increasing number of staff, an increasing capital program, turnover and retirements. We had COVID-19. Obviously, everybody's working from home, and I think there's a little bit of a loss of that undocumented knowledge and process. And we also had changes in NERC requirements and our interpretations of them. And we had an increasing focus on compliance and assurance that meant that non-compliances were more likely to be discovered. So all of that led to a growing realization that we needed formal documented processes and controls to manage the many project compliance interfaces. So our first attempts at this were largely organic. It wasn't me. Basically, we developed a single checklist with some very basic questions. Are you working on the BES? Are you in a physical security perimeter? And if the answer was yes, the project teams would be given a list of standards that might apply. The checklist was required, but there were no controls built in. There was no guidance really on when to run the document or who to send it to, beyond a few small breadcrumbs. And so it was a really important first step, and it's reinforced something that I think is important about implementing changes in a large organization, and that's often you'll find bottom-up solutions have been attempted to try to solve a systemic problem, and they might not be wholly successful, but they give you a few threads of really key learnings and ideas to build on. So the momentum really started in 2021 when we got the executive mandate. They basically said projects have to stop having non-compliances and violations, period. That sponsorship and mandate unlocked resources and a sense of urgency. It gave us people's time and attention. It unlocked money for us to engage with a consultant. And we worked with Guidehouse throughout this whole process, both in defining, developing, and implementing this initiative. And so one of the first steps was to engage with all the stakeholders to identify systematically who was involved, and then interview them and get a sense of really what the current state and issues were from multiple perspectives. That engagement drove buy-in. Having had a chance to vent their frustrations, express their ideas and some solutions as to how things could run better, we really got a commitment from them to help jointly develop a new solution. And I know it's a bit cliche, but I do think it's really true that if you plan the battle, you won't battle the plan. So with the findings and an understanding of our gaps, we really had a path forward to build out our people, our processes, and our tools, and build a comprehensive approach to project compliance that not only addresses those, but also integrates into the underlying systems all of the controls that we need, rather than tacking them on as an afterthought. So we'll talk a little bit about the people and process first. Tools are going to come shortly. On the people side, one of our biggest issues was that from the project perspective, there was no one-stop shop. We had nobody to go and talk to when we didn't know where to go. We needed somebody who we could reach out to if we were stuck, or a place that would cover all the processes, even if they weren't the experts. So we also knew that we needed an assurance function, again, that covered all requirements, a person that could authoritatively tell a project that they had met all of the requirements and they'd worked with all of the right people to move forward. So we knew that we would have to change that. We had a mandate to create that role, but we also knew that we didn't have unlimited resources and we couldn't put a compliance person into every single project. So we had to define how that new role of the project compliance advisor would work and interact with others. And this essentially is how we see the project compliance lifecycle at a very high level. It starts even before the project has. Yeah. Before it even begins, the project may get a high-level assessment of whether it's likely to trigger some NERC requirements. But the real work starts in step 2, which is our MRS identification. And that's where the project team has a design in hand, at least a first iteration, and the first task is to assess the scope and figure out what standards we're triggering. And this also involves contacting the relevant compliance leads to confirm and getting the project on their radar. So that's our step 2, MRS identification. Once you know what the standards are that are triggered, it really comes down to developing the so what do we need to do? And that's what we called our deliverables development. From a project language point of view, we're really focused on scope, milestones, and deliverables. So this was the language that that really resonated with us. And it was all about achieving clarity and specificity and agreement on what needed to be provided to whom by when. Once we had that agreed, and we knew that we had every one of our standards that we were triggering covered off, when the project now gets into detailed final design, construction, execution, testing, and commissioning, the project team has a clear roadmap. They've got a deliverables list that they can assign project team members to, they can track the status, and they can confirm that they have submitted and had accepted those deliverables. This also is a place where it really ties into our existing project controls and our energization processes, and it ensures that compliance requirements don't fall through any cracks. So that's kind of a key control point for us. And then finally, project completion. Project completion is all about tying off any remaining trailing deliverables, loose ends, and the like. So making sure that on the NERC compliance side, we've also closed off any kind of trailing requirements. So we're almost at the point now. We've got our people, we've got our processes, and we needed to develop some tools. And Sophie's going to give you a demonstration of the more complicated tool, which is our applicability tool. I just want to talk a little bit about what we knew we would need it to do. We knew this was going to be the most complicated tool for us. We needed to be able to basically ensure that we had a tool that would allow project teams to self-identify potential requirements. And so as a project manager, you got a design in hand. Your first question really is, what standards am I impacting and who do I need to contact about my project? So the first thing we knew that it would need to do is we knew we needed to narrow down standards just to the ones that could be potentially impacted. There's some standards that no matter what we do on the project, we're not going to impact or trigger a deliverables requirement. The next thing was that we had that clear mandate, universal assessment. The mandate was no violation, so we knew we would need every project to do this tool, and we needed to have clear and efficient off-ramps for projects that clearly had no NERC implications. We then, the next part of this really was the iterative process. So one of the key concepts in project management is progressive elaboration, that as the design is refined and your project plans are developed, your scope, cost, schedule, uncertainty is reduced. And so at BC Hydro, depending on the size and complexity, we can have up to 4 distinct design stages. And so we knew that the tool would have to be able to handle that iterative process as the design is refined and their scope clarity is achieved. We also knew that we were going to have too many projects for the compliance people to be assessing this. It was going to have to be a self-assessment by our project team. And so we needed it to have screening questions that could be answered by people who were not familiar with compliance requirements. So this was particularly challenging, asking a compliance team to define a yes or no question, where if the answer is no, you'll never hear from the project. So make sure you got it right. That was quite a challenge, and it took quite a long time to make sure that we had nailed those questions down. And finally, we needed built-in controls. We needed notification processes. We needed documented workflows. We needed to be able to audit these and track them against our other project systems so that we knew that projects were consistently doing this when they were supposed to be. So I'm going to pass it over to Sophie here, but I do want to make one final point, which is that we had a lot of discussion about what platform we were going to build our tool on, and we ultimately chose Excel. We discussed this, very vigorous discussion about this. There's pros and cons. We realized that, number one, it's relatively simple to develop. Number two, the end user is familiar with Excel files. And so the output is an Excel file. It's not something you have to teach people how to use. And we also knew that eventually we'd put this live, the initiative money would dry up, and we would still need to make changes to the tool. And Excel is very good at being able to be managed cost efficiently, being able to be revised either for new standards or changes as we learn from the process. So I'll pass it over to Sophie now. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Alan. All right. I'm going to quit the slideshow. Give me 2 seconds. Okay. So the tool is housed on an extranet page. So everyone with a BC Hydro LAN ID, that's not sharing. What did I need to do? I don't know. I think I quit.
You're sharing screen too.
Yeah, this should be screen 2. What is that?
No. Share screen 2.
Yes, should have done.
Share this. Just like that. I just want to hide that.
Okay, yeah, fantastic. Thank you. Okay, so it's housed on an extranet page, and it's our MRS projects homepage. So we have on there basic information about our training, top tips on how to use the tool. And then the lower section of our page, we have the MRS applicability tool. So the project teams can access the tool, they can access the screening guidance and the user guide, and they can also log tickets for change requests or report any issues with the tool. Or what usually happens is people just send us a Teams notice and say, hey, it's not working. The project teams just click on this big blue button and it opens and downloads for them. And what they see is, not that one. What they see is, there we go. What they see is, as Alan said, an Excel format. So what they do is they just provide us with their project number. Each project has a unique identifier, a project title, a project description. We don't ask for war and peace, but we need enough information just to get an idea on looking at it. It just helps us with our resource planning, who's reviewing. The current phase of the project, as Alan said, the projects go through different design phases. A link to their statement of objectives. This is a scoping document in BC Hydro. Think of it as a business case, anything like that, which gives you a full scope of work of the project. The project's in service date. We do deal with projects, obviously, with multiple in-service dates, multiple energization dates. The scoping documents gives all that. We ask for the earliest in-service date so we can prioritize that project's review, the project manager's name and the project engineer's name, because it's always great to know who you're talking to. One thing to talk to really quickly is this link here. Click here for guidance documents. This is really important. So the screening guidance, the guidance, we made it accessible in the tool, but it is not integrated into it. So the screening guidance is really valuable for our project teams. It provides them with information to help them to answer the questions. So we didn't include this actually embedded into the MRS applicability tool because we are constantly refining the guidance. Every time a project says, hey, I didn't really understand this. Can you explain this in a different way? Yeah, great point. Let's put that into our guidance. Or the interpretation has changed from a BC Hydro perspective of how we deal with that standard. We need to reflect that in our guidance, or we want to add another standard to that question, or remove a standard from that question because we've added it to a different question. Each one of those is a change. Now, to change the tool's programming changes its version control. And so when you change the version control, the tool knows and says to the user, hey, no, you've not got the most up-to-date version. This is our control to make sure that our project teams are always using the most up-to-date version of the MRS applicability tool. But that would mean that our project teams are constantly then checking and then rechecking and then having to download another copy. So what we do is we make sure that we keep the guidance separate so that we can be dynamic with the guidance, but be very structured and controlled with our updates of the tool. So this is our project. So let's just set the stage. I'm a project manager. My project engineer and I, we've met with the project compliance advisor team, which of course were extremely helpful. I've got two projects, both at a stage where I need to run the MRS applicability tool. I've talked to the project compliance advisor team about the scopes, and I've used the guidance on how to answer the questions. So I'm ready to go. I'm ready to go and run the MRS applicability tool. So my first project scope is this, my first one here. So what am I doing? Now, this is one we see a lot of. So this, here I am, I'm project manager. My scope is, I am replacing some infrastructure in a public use area. So I'm upgrading an overflow parking lot as well as some public trails. So I've answered all the questions, my tier 1 screening questions, and the last slide of our slide deck does have these screening questions for you. So I've answered these tier 1 screening questions all as no. So I've generated my report, I've submitted it for review using the workflow. Just to make it clear, when a project team answers no, it doesn't just slip out there into the ether. It gets reviewed by the project compliance advisor team. So this is our control to ensure that the questions are answered correctly. So it's a project doesn't immediately get a pass and say, hey, no applicable MRS, off you go. They are reviewed, and then a project team is given a compliance summary report. So in this case, I'm not working at a generation station. My sole scope is to upgrade a parking lot. I am not accessing any designated physical security perimeters, and I'm not adding or removing any electronic devices. So I've answered all of my questions as no, and then I've generated my report. So I've done my workflow. I get one reviewer, the project compliance advisor team, and then they've reviewed it and they give me this wonderful email that says, thank you very much. You have no applicable MRS. Off you go, unless you change your scope. In that case, please let us know, and we may need you to rerun the tool. So that's my first project there. So now let's take a look at running the MRS applicability tool when we're a project with applicable MRS, because as you might have thought, there's a little bit more involved. So again, to reiterate, running the tool is part of the mandatory milestones in the project lifecycle. So if the project team misses this, we also do have other controls in place to scoop them up. So I'm a different project. So I'm back, I'm a project manager. So this is my second project. So I'm actually putting in a new substation. So I'm addressing the electricity supply reliability for an area. So I'm going to replace the current substation into a substation that's going to take more load. So this is my project. I am at a really early phase here. So I'm at a feasibility design phase. This is my first run of the MRS applicability tool. I've provided a link to all of my project documentation, and I've provided all of my date information. Okay, let's take a look at these responses. So I've looked at the guidance, and I've answered my questions. Okay, so looking at it from an advisor perspective, question 1, that's my BES question. You can see that that's my general, and they're general for a reason, because as Alan said earlier, these are the off-ramp questions. So am I touching what we have designated as part of the bulk electric system? Yes, I am. And I've given some notes here for the advisor. So will my work, am I actually going into any designated physical security perimeter? And in our guidance, we provide ways to check that. Yes, I am. Am I adding, removing, modifying electronic devices? Yes, I am. So I have MRS impacts. So I need to move on to my tier 2 questions. Sorry, I'm just going to scroll that, put that right to the beginning. Sorry, it's just going to, there we go. So on my tier 2 questions, I'm not going to go through every single question for you, but in my tier 2 questions, I need to provide a yes, a no, or a TBD. We provide that to be determined for our project teams purely because at early stages, sometimes you can't provide those answers, or sometimes you're just actually not sure. And really, it has to be said that sometimes we're not sure. And then we need our SMEs and our compliance leads to actually help us out with that determination of is that standard applicable or not. And just to say, if any of you want to see copies of the tool or talk through it, Alan and I's contact information is at the end. Just reach out to us. We are more than happy to talk through this, show you examples, give you a list of standards in the tool, because this is all about sharing what's worked for us. So don't hesitate to reach out. Okay, so in this case, so I've worked through my answers, and I just want to scroll down to show you as well that we do provide conditional formatting in the tool because we want our teams to be as efficient as possible. And so this is a transmission project. So we've provided the project teams with the questions that are applicable to our transmission projects. If it was generation, they would be shown those questions. And if it's both, they hit the jackpot and they get to see all of the questions. Okay, so I've answered all the questions and I'm ready to generate my final report. So my final report is an output, which gives lists of potential applicable standards and a project contact. The project contact is what our project teams use in their workflow. These are the teams who are doing the initial reviews, which then comes to the project compliance advisor team to do the final review and give a report. So, and I'll just do a quick scroll down. As you can see, it just looks basically the same, just lists of the standards with contacts. I'm sure one question you're all thinking is, well, this is all great, but the tool is showing the standards now. What about as they change? And so the standards actually in the tool are not static. So what does that mean? So it means that the tool shows the currently effective and future effective standards in BC. So the project teams are always screening against what is applicable now and what is going to be applicable in the future. And so we review on an annual basis the new standards slated to be implemented in BC. We assess their potential applicability to the project teams. And if there are any changes in the way we need to address the questions, we review that with our compliance leads, with our SMEs within the reliability standards assurance team, and we decide whether we need to do additional standards, additional questions. You'll see from, for example, EOP 11-2, our 7R8, we put together a new question for that with new guidance for the project teams. So we review, and then if a standard changes when a project is in flight, then we track each project, we track its deliverables, and we know which standards are applicable to which projects, and then we can advise the project teams and notify them of their new, or if they're really lucky, they're reduced compliance deliverables. Okay, and that is our MRS applicability tool. And I am going to go back to our presentation, and I'm going, fingers crossed that I don't break it this time. Did I? Yes.
Yep.
Okay, yeah. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sophie. So that's the applicability tool. A couple of the key points that really help us there It provides that project contact, and it also provides the compliance lead, which previously we didn't know who that was for a given standard, and it's tied to an actively managed list on SharePoint. So if there is a compliance lead that changes, you run the tool, you get a new name. And so I will, sorry, I'm just getting something that says I can't connect to audio. I'm just going to ignore that and presume that we're all good here. The other key part of it is it gives that connection point, the breadcrumbs for us to follow up in the project contact mailboxes. And that's actually something that came out sort of after our implementation of this. The compliance teams realized that they needed message boxes rather than getting it sent to individual people. And that's actually that helps with controls because you don't have something where it falls through the crack of an individual's mailbox. But let's talk a little bit about deliverables. The deliverables are essentially, we know now what standards we're triggering, and it really comes down to what do we have to produce, who do we have to submit it to, by when, in order for us to be compliant. And this was one of those organic ideas, essentially, that we built upon. We noticed that one of our compliance leads who works on PRC and mod deliverables, I think, quite frankly, he had been getting tired of working with individual project teams to assess and explain everything that they had to do based on each individual piece of scope. And so he built a cheat sheet. It was a relatively simple piece of, 2 or 3 page document that laid out, depending on the scope you had, what he needed from you in order for the project to be compliant. And so we took a look at that and we said, we need this for every single requirement. And that sounds great. It was a lot harder to do than it might seem. And so the reason for that being a little bit challenging was, again, it really comes down to, you ask a compliance team, hey, what sort of deliverables would you need from a project? And the inevitable answer is going to be, well, it depends on the scope. So the way we got around that was we worked on actual projects. The first project, once we had our template laid out, the first project that triggered a standard, we said, okay, great, you need to work with the compliance team, build out a deliverables list. Once we had that for that scope of work, we uploaded it to that same web page that Sophie was just showing, and that became the template. The next project that came along with the same requirements, if there were changes, if there was a different piece of scope and we had some further clarifications, that got added to. So we just basically built it over time off of actual project scope and actual project deliverables. Now, the thing about that is it's never just going to be a pick list. Project teams do get to go and select the templates that based on the particular deliverables that they're, or the requirements that they're triggering, but it's never going to be as simple as just download this, that, and the other, and I'm done. The project team still has to review that template, make it their own based on the specific scope, and really they have to understand what the deliverables are asking for. And they have to go back to the compliance lead and confirm that they have that understanding. It's that agreement and understanding that is the key part of the deliverables development process. Once we've done that for every single requirement that we trigger, we go to Sophie, our compliance advisor, or one of our other compliance advisors now, to confirm that, yes, we've got that agreement across all of our standards. Once we have that, it's really straightforward to turn this into a punch list. And that's where the project team just takes it. We're going into construction. We're going to be doing commissioning. We're going to be doing testing. We have a punch list that it's basically the same document, just some columns on the far right are around, who's in the best place to get this particular document, whether it's a photo of a nameplate, whether it's some testing and commissioning records. And we don't just say testing and commissioning records. We get very, very specific because that's an easy way to end up with some oversights. So we assign it to the right person on the project team and they track and manage it. We fill that out and all of those punch lists become ultimately linked with the actual evidence that we've submitted it to the compliance lead. They've verified that they accept it. And that becomes our key control document because when we get into our energization process and we're tying into our energization process or our fit for service process, that punch list, that completed and accepted punch list is the one that we show that says we have done everything that we agreed to up front. And we don't have to go around and talk to every single compliance lead. We just come back to the compliance advisor and say, you've already saw that this was the agreed scope of work for us to be compliant. We have now done it. You can test, you can audit any individual item. We are complete. We're ready to energize. And so that's how the deliverables piece works to make sure that we don't let anything fall through the cracks, and it ties into our existing systems, our existing operating orders, and our existing controls. So the final thing is implementation. This all sounds great, but no plan survives first contact with real life. Ultimately, we wanted to make sure that we had as few changes to this process as possible before we went live. And so we spent months testing it and refining it with actual projects. This is essential. It makes sure that we identify what works, what doesn't work, and what parts of our process and instructions aren't clear. Once we had that and we revised our process a little bit more and made sure that we were comfortable with it, we then went into initial training. We trained every project manager, every project engineer, and every compliance lead in the organization, hundreds of people, both employees and consultants, on this new process before we went live. It was in-person facilitated training. We had also done the hiring process at that point, and we had fortunately, the stars had aligned, and we had Sophie Pilkington had recently joined just before we went live on the 1st of July, 2022. And then it came to onboarding. And so there were really two major challenges with onboarding. The first one is basically something that happens every time you try and change a project process. It's how do you manage in-flight projects? And you want to try and find that balance between rapid adoption of the new practice versus making a project that might be on final approach to their in-service date come to a screeching halt while they run a whole new process and set of documents. It's not a great way to make yourself popular. And, quite frankly, already presenting a whole bunch of new compliance process, you're not already in the good books anyways. So what we did in our case was we took a grandfather approach. We did 3 months. So for 3 months, any project with an in-service date or an asset energization date within 3 months of our go-live date would not have to complete the new documentation, but we would have an elevated level of review by our compliance teams on those projects. So that's how we managed that piece. The second piece really was, we have hundreds of projects. We introduce this new process to them, and then they all jump on board and they all start submitting our MRS applicability tools. Frankly, we were a victim of our own success. We knew that it was coming. It's the bow wave effect, right? The compliance teams were being inundated with information about all these different projects, in many cases, projects that they had never heard about before and that they needed to hear about. So it was a good thing, but it was also a challenge. We knew it was coming, and the way we managed it was essentially triaging. We worked the project groups and the compliance teams work together to identify which projects are most important, which ones are going into construction, have outages, looking to energize, and we would prioritize the review of those, and we would put the, a project that may be in some kind of feasibility design stage, early days yet, and we might put them to the side. And we would try to let people know, look, we've got a big backlog. We have not forgotten about you. You can carry on with your project processes. You've done your part, you've submitted it. We will manage the backlog in the meantime so that we're not going to hold your project up, but we'll get to you once we've been able to work through the backlog. And so that was a couple of the key challenges and ways that we approached the implementation.
And as one of those people who actually worked through that backlog, it was a great team effort. We started last Christmas. We were frantically trying to get to a queue level of under 200 projects. And right now we've managed to get to an active queue of around 120, which is a huge testament to the amazing team that I work with. So how do we keep this going? So we've already talked about the sustainment of the standards and the questions in the tool. From the implementation of the MRS applicability tool, we've been working with the project teams and the compliance teams, listening to feedback to ensure we have the core requirements in place. The tool has to work, not just from a compliance perspective, but also has to be usable for our project teams. We're always looking for efficiencies and ways we can make the process smoother for our reviewers and project teams, and such as for our maintenance programs. So we have our maintenance programs have a large number of projects underneath them. And so we look for opportunities to work with those PMs. Can we reduce the number of tools that they need to run? So we try and group in bulk electric systems. So are they BESS sites? Are they non-BESS sites? Are they carrying out the same maintenance, repetitive maintenance? Or is there something different about it at this particular site? So we try to be as efficient as we can and work with all of our project teams. From a sustainment perspective, of course, we're fully aware that compliance fatigue is out there. So to try and combat that, Alan and I, and we have special guests from SIP teams, from our own project compliance advisor teams. So we run a quarterly training program. We try to make it as engaging as possible, as fun as possible, because we know that reliability is not the most exciting subject out there for everybody. I know, hard to believe. By running quarterly sessions, we train the new project managers, the project engineers, and we also get a lot of repeat attendees, people who just want to get a refresher or just want to know what's new within the MRS applicability tools. And in terms of sustainment, we're always looking forward, not just at the efficiencies, but also what the tool of the future looks like. So as Alan said, and as you've seen, the tool is Excel based now, but will it always be? Probably not. We work hard doing tracking and metrics out of separate spreadsheets. You know, one Excel spreadsheet breeds another Excel spreadsheet, and then you need to track that with another Excel spreadsheet. And so it all requires a lot of manual tracking and processes. And so a database-driven platform may be the way to go. And as the tool process matures and more people use it, we know that no matter what, that journey is going to be an exciting one to see where it's going to be next. And so to wrap all this up for you, so where did we start? So we started with an ad hoc system, with a checklist, no real owner of the process, with the project teams having to figure it out to some respect for themselves, and no single point of contact. There were some really useful processes within all of that, and amazing people, our compliance teams, working those processes, but nothing to link all that together for the project teams. So it was based on an assumed compliance model, no control, checks and balances for those project teams. And where have we got to? So we've got an MRS project compliance process, which is integrated into the capital project practice. We have stakeholder engagement, which is continual, as is the focus on being efficient and proactive in the process and having a sustainable tool in place to identify potential applicable reliability standards for our project teams. We now have a project compliance advisor team. So there's 6 of us now, and we are a single point of contact for anyone with an MRS query. And it really is any MRS query. We excel at the random, and we're always there. We have embedded controls to ensure that the project teams run the tool. And we also are there to make sure that the project teams are clear on their MRS compliance deliverables, and they complete those deliverables to ensure continued compliance. Thank you very much. That's Alan and I's contact information. It's included in the slide deck. Like I said, we haven't given you a full copy of the MRS applicability tool in there. We've given you the tier 1 questions, primarily because this tool was developed for BC Hydro. So it's got BC Hydro specific questions. It's got a BC Hydro focus, but we are absolutely more than happy to talk to any of you about it. We can give you the list of the standards that we have assigned and is applicable to projects. So don't hesitate to reach out and we can pass those on to you. And with that, any questions?
Hi.
On there.
Great presentation. Congratulations on Site C, and good to see you again. Question, you might see where this is going, but I was just reading some reports. I think BC Hydro is going to issue a call for, it looks like a 30% expected growth in demand for electricity by 2030. Do you see yourself as a potential resource or partner for those future IBRs or independent power producers that are not hydro? They're obviously going to connect to your system in terms of what you're developing for. You're really kind of setting a trend here for compliance from the beginning of the project until it's commissioned, particularly in capital. So do you see yourself as a resource for those future projects that hydro is going to call for in the province?
Totally. So as a resource from a BC Hydro perspective, absolutely. So for any capital projects, so especially the interconnection side, we work with a lot of the interconnection projects, and absolutely we are a resource. We assist all of them in helping them assess their MRS applicability, and we are fully aware that the wave of projects is just going to increase and increase, which is why we recently recruited 2 amazing new project compliance advisors onto the team as well to help assess that. But totally, Bill, yeah, we fully expect to be a resource for all of the BC Hydro projects, managing those.
Thank you.
Thank you.
A quick question that was really fabulous, and it makes me wish I would have had something like this in previous jobs. There's a difference between documenting compliance and ensuring that those things that are required for compliance are done. So let's think about facility ratings, right? Let's think about other types of OMP standards that you have to have in place. Are there any controls that you all put in place that actually prevent someone from energizing a station, for example, because let's say the facility rating didn't make it to the database, which didn't make it to somebody else that needs it? Do you have those types of controls as well? Because that can be really hard when you're looking at rate making and getting plant in service. And there's always that push and pull between those 2 types of things. Were you all able to do anything like that?
Yep, totally. So the projects, so say for example, let's use facility ratings. So the project teams will be asked then, if they have applicability for FAC 8, they'll be asked to follow through on a deliverables list. So the deliverables list itself doesn't have that kind of cutoff. So, but the project teams have to provide, say, for example, they have to provide their draft drawings, they have to provide certain other pieces of information, all within a systematic time frame. So they have to follow those time frames of those requirements into those specific business unit subject matter expert areas. So then they are all aware of that project, and then the project itself goes through those other BC Hydro controls to ensure that those requirements are maintained before energization. So yeah, there's a full commissioning notice to energize process, and also a commissioning notice to operate process.
No, that's great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jenny Wake from Tacoma Power, but I'm actually asking questions for Lennon Marin. It's my... So I actually have 2 questions. The first one is, you may have already covered this, but so you have a compliance project team. Does that team report up through your compliance organization or your project organization?
Compliance.
Okay.
So yeah, we're part of the reliability standards assurance team, which is part of the compliance framework. So we report up to General Counsel.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then the second question is, and you kind of touched on it, but we wanted more details of, how engaged were your staff in the rollout? Did you have strong buy-in, or did you get like this is just one more thing that we have to do for compliance?
Yeah, so that, and Sophie mentioned it, compliance fatigue is real.
Yeah.
I think there's a couple of things. So we did get buy-in, we did get engagement. There were a few things that helped with that. First off, we had that executive mandate, and it was really, really clear, and it was being driven down the organization and down through the project delivery organization. So our executive vice president, our vice president, our directors, my director was making it abundantly clear that we absolutely could not have any violations. They had got the message loud and clear. So there's number one, you're getting that message coming from the project organization. The second piece was the project teams were deeply involved. In fact, I was the lead on the initiative. So, we were really developing the compliance process and working very closely with compliance groups, but there wasn't that sort of, oh, compliance is trying to tell us how to do things. We were in control of how the practices would look. I mean, working very, very closely with them. And I think we've really kept that up throughout, is just, there is almost not much, there is very little distinction between, say, my follow-up and Sophie's, except she knows way more about compliance than I do. And so we try to work very, very closely together so to minimize that sort of compliance project interface. And at the end of the day, there's still going to be, I mean, we have a lot of processes. It's not just in our compliance. So anytime you introduce it, there is a little bit of, it's another thing to do. Part of it is to try and demonstrate how easy it can be, especially if you're just doing that public use area, repaving some roads. 3 questions, hit a button, send it in, you're done. And you get to mark your milestone as met, right? That's it. So trying to make sure that we were looking at it from a project team.
Thank you. Great presentation.
We did have an online question asking you to clarify again, what work group in BC Hydro manages the MRS tool?
Sure. So the tool is owned by the Reliability Standards Assurance Group. So it's owned by a compliance group. But as Alan reiterated, it's that we do that constant stakeholder engagement. So even though it's owned by a compliance group, it really is. We do try to make sure that it's also written from a project focus.
It was one of the elements that we talked about early on, was who was going to own it, who was going to sustain it. And then also it was a question of where do the practices live? So we have that MRS project page, but we also have within our project practices, which is really where project managers will go to understand what they need to do and when across every different part of a project lifecycle. We had instructions specific to them, and we had links and jumps over to the page so that you're basically, the information can be found where project teams know to look for information on process and documentation.
There are no other questions from the online group. Thank you. We now have